There are blank spaces on every map, white voids that cartographers call areas of ignorance. Most are empty because of brutal terrain or political strife, but some voids exist for a different reason. They are not empty spaces. They are wounds, carved into the world by things that demand to be forgotten. I was the man hired to map such a wound, and I learned that what lies within is not ignorance, but a silence that screams. My name is Kael Vance, and I am a ghost, not in the literal sense, but in the professional one. I am a cartographer who specializes in making the unknown known, a skill highly sought after by corporations with interests far from the public eye. I take their blank spaces and fill them with lines, grids, and names. In return, they pay me enough to disappear again. The contract came from a shell corporation called Terra Obscura Acquisitions. It was as anonymous as it was lucrative. The task was simple on paper: create the first complete topographical and architectural survey of the Kalatika Mosh, the fortress of Salanza Deep, unmapped valley system in a remote stretch of Balochistan's Macron Range. The file was thin on geological data, but thick with local mythology. The tribes that bordered the valley spoke of it in whispers, calling it the place where sound goes to die. They claimed that those who entered either never returned or came back as empty shells, their voices and memories scoured away. I dismissed it as folklore, the kind of fearful hyperbole that clings to any place untamed by man. The real challenge, I believed, was the terrain. But when I met my contact in a sterile air-conditioned office in Karachi, the folklore felt chillingly present. He was a man with no name, just a title. The client, he pushed a satellite phone and a hardened data drive across the polished table. Your only contact will be this device, he said, his voice a dry rustle. Transmit your survey data daily. Do not attempt voice communication. The atmospheric conditions in the valley are anomalous. They interfere with audio signals. It was a lie. I knew it, and he knew I knew it. But the number on the contract was large enough to purchase a lifetime of willful ignorance. Weeks later, I stood at the valley's edge. My local guide, a grizzled old man named Jabbar, went no further. His face was a mask of sun-baked leather, his eyes filled with a deep, ancestral dread. He pointed a trembling finger towards the narrow, stone-toothed entrance. Beyond this point, the sky has no voice, he warned, his own voice barely a whisper. The gin of silence will drink your thoughts and leave you hollow. He pressed a small, intricately carved wooden charm into my hand. This will not save you, but it may help you remember the sound of your own name when you forget it. I thanked him, pocketed the charm, and walked into the valley alone. The transition was not immediate, but it was absolute. One moment, I could hear the wind whistling through the canyon entrance and the crunch of gravel under my boots. The next, there was nothing. Not quiet, not peace. It was a thick, oppressive, and total absence of sound. It was like being plunged 1,000 feet underwater. The pressure in my ears was immense. I shouted, a reflexive act of defiance. My throat vibrated, my chest constricted, but no sound emerged. It was simply, I pushed forward for an hour. The unnatural silence, a physical weight on my shoulders. Then, as the canyon walls fell away, I saw it. It was not a fortress. It was a city, an entire, sprawling metropolis carved from the living rock of the valley floor, with towers that speared towards the silent sky. It was perfectly preserved, impossibly ancient, and utterly, deafeningly quiet. I stood at the threshold of the silent city, a place that shouldn't exist, wrapped in a silence that couldn't be real. My modern equipment felt like useless toys against the profound wrongness of it all. I had come to map a valley, to conquer a blank space with data and logic. But as I took my first soundless step into its dead streets, I felt a strange, cold thought flicker in my mind that wasn't my own. It wasn't a voice, but a feeling. An ancient and hungry presence that had just noticed its first visitor in 1,000 years. It was the silence itself, and it was glad I had come. The most dangerous predator is not the one that hunts your body, but the one that hunts your mind. In the silent city, I was not being watched. I was being read. Every thought, every memory, every flicker of my own consciousness was a scent on the wind for an entity that had not eaten in millennia. I walked the main thoroughfare of the city, a place I began to call Akasha, a Sanskrit word for the primordial essence of space. The name felt right, for the city was a vessel of profound emptiness. The architecture was unlike anything I had ever seen, a haunting fusion of Mesopotamian ziggurats and organic, flowing lines. Buildings spiraled towards the sky like fossilized seashells, and there were no stairs, only smooth, winding ramps. There were no doors, only arched, open entry. It was a city built for a people who had nothing to hide and no reason to bar entry. My first task was to establish a baseline survey. I powered up my equipment, a laser-based distance meter, a high-resolution camera, and my data slate. As I began my work, I noticed the first truly unsettling detail. There was no dust, not a single particle. The air was unnaturally pure, the stone streets and buildings immaculately clean, as if the city had been abandoned only an hour ago, not for thousands of years. It was a preserved corpse, perfect and sterile. I worked for what felt like hours. My mind focused on the mathematical precision of my task. I measured angles, logged coordinates, and took hundreds of photos. It was during this deep focus that the entity I had sensed at the gate made its first move. I was trying to label a photograph of a large central plaza dominated by a monolithic obsidian spire. The word for spire was on the tip of my tongue. I knew the word. I could feel its shape in my mind. The S, the P. But it wouldn't come. It was like reaching for an object in a dark room and having my fingers pass right through it. The word was just gone. I shook my head, attributing it to the disorienting pressure and the lack of auditory feedback. I settled for tall, pointy thing and moved on, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Later, as I was documenting the intricate carvings on a building wall, I tried to recall my mother's face. It was a memory I cherished, one I could summon instantly. But this time, the image was blurry. Her smile was there, but her eyes, I couldn't remember the color of her eyes. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through me. This was more than disorientation. The silence wasn't just outside me. It was seeping in, driven by a new, frantic urgency. I pushed deeper into the city. I was no longer just a cartographer. I was a man searching for answers in a place that consumed them. I found what looked like a residential district with smaller, more intimate structures. In one of them, I found the first sign of a previous visitor. It was a camp, modern and clearly out of place. A weathered tent, a rusted set of tools, and a leather-bound journal lying open on a stone table. The handwriting inside was erratic, a frantic scrawl that bespoke a mind coming apart at the seams. It belonged to a British explorer named Alistair Finch Stay, same name as the linguist from another story I'd conceived. A fitting echo who had vanished 2 decades ago. His first entries were filled with wonder, just like my own initial feelings. He wrote of the city's impossible beauty and the profound silence. But then, his writing began to change. Words were crossed out, sentences left unfinished. He wrote about the thief of thoughts. It drinks them. One entry read, the complex ones first. Poetry, mathematics, love, it leaves the simple things. Hunger, fear, it is not killing me, it is simplifying me. I flipped to the last page of the journal. There was no date, only a single, crudely drawn diagram. It was a map of the city, but at its very center, where the great obsidian spire stood, he had drawn a spiral, a vortex. Beneath it, 6 words were scrawled with a desperate, shaky hand. The last echoes of a brilliant mind being erased. They were not a warning. They were a revelation of the horror's true nature. How do you fight a monster that lives in your head? You cannot shoot it. You cannot run from it. You can only starve it. And its food was everything that made me human. To survive in the silent city, I had to learn to become as empty as the streets around me. The 6 words in Alistair Finch's journal burned in my mind. It doesn't just eat thoughts, it digests them. The revelation was a paradigm shift. I wasn't just losing my memory. My mind was being consumed, broken down, and turned into fuel for the ancient consciousness that saturated this valley. The entity wasn't just a thief. It was a predator, and I was its first meal in decades. Finch's madness was not random. It was a roadmap of my own future. I had to understand the rules of this hunt. Before I became another half-finished journal entry, I reread his frantic scrawls, not as the ravings of a lunatic, but as a survival guide. The complex ones first. Poetry, mathematics, love. The entity was drawn to complex, abstract thought. My scientific mind, my cartographer's precision, my love for language, these were not my strengths here. They were liabilities. They were bait. I had to change. I had to learn to be silent, not just in my voice, but in my mind. I packed a bag with water and rations and left Finch's camp, using his crude map as my guide. My destination was the obsidian spire at the city's heart, the vortex. As I walked, I practiced the new rules. I forced myself to think in simple, direct terms. Walk, drink, breathe, left foot, right foot. I suppressed every memory that tried to surface, every complex emotion. When a flicker of my mother's face appeared, I pushed it down. When I marveled at the impossible architecture, I forced my mind blank. I turned myself from a thinking man into a simple machine of survival. It was agonizing. My mind, so used to constant analysis and internal monologue, bucked against the restraints. But the proof that it was working was as subtle as it was terrifying. As I simplified my thoughts, the pressure in my ears lessened. The feeling of being watched, of being read, began to fade into the background. I was learning how to hide in plain sight within my own consciousness. But the entity was not to be starved, so as if I would not provide it with fresh thoughts, it would offer me old ones. As I drew closer to the city's center, I began to experience echoes, faint, fragmented whispers that were not my own. Eleanor, the smell of rain on the moors, a flash of a woman's face I'd never seen. The prime numbers, they sing. A string of complex equations that made my head ache. It was Finch. I was hearing the digested remnants of his mind. The entity was spewing back the scraps of its last meal, trying to tempt me, to lure me back into complex thought with the ghosts of another man's memories. The horror of it was absolute. To be haunted not by a man's ghost, but by the disembodied, digested fragments of his soul. I clenched my jaw, held on to the simple mantra walk. Drink, breathe, and push the echoes away. Finally, I reached the Grand Plaza. The obsidian spire loomed before me, a pillar of pure blackness that seemed to drink the very light from the air. It was a monument to nothingness. Finch's map had called it a vortex. And as I approached, I understood why. There was no door, no entrance. The base of the spire was a smooth, unbroken surface. But I could feel a low subaudable vibration emanating from it, a silent thrum that resonated deep in my bones. The silence here was different. It was older, deeper, and hungrier. I circled the base of the spire, my hand tracing the cold, featureless stone. There seemed to be no way in. Defeated, I looked at Finch's journal one last time. At the bottom of his hand-drawn map, I noticed something I had missed before. A small, almost invisible addendum. It wasn't a word. It was a smear of dark brownish red next to a simple instruction. My blood ran cold as I realized what the smear was and what the instruction meant. The spire didn't have a keyhole. It had a toll, and the price of entry was a memory, willingly given. The ultimate currency of the soul is memory. In a place that fed on knowledge, I had to decide which piece of myself I was willing to burn to buy an answer. The spire demanded a sacrifice, and I stood before it like an ancient priest, forced to choose which part of my own history to offer up to a silent, hungry God. Finch's final instruction was as simple as it was monstrous: a memory for a key, blood for the lock. The dark smear on the page was a testament to his own desperate sacrifice. He had paid the toll, and it had driven him mad. Now, it was my turn. The entity, this vast, silent consciousness, fed on complex thought. To open the door, I couldn't just offer it a random fact. I had to give it a rich, textured piece of my life, a memory laced with emotion, ambition, and abstract meaning. My mind reeled. Which piece of myself could I afford to lose? The memory of my mother's face? No, that was too precious. My first love? The pain of losing that was still a part of who I was. I needed a memory that was foundational to my identity, yet one I could survive without. A pillar, not the keystone. I made my choice. I thought of my graduation from the Geodetic Institute. I summoned the memory in its entirety. The weight of the ceremonial robes, the swell of orchestral music, the heady mix of pride and anxiety, the complex cartographic theories I had mastered spinning in my head. It was the birth of my professional self, the very foundation of the man who had walked into this valley. Following the ghost of Finch's instruction, I pulled a small utility knife from my pack. With a steady hand, I made a small, shallow cut on my thumb. The sting of it, a frantic sensation in the crushing silence. I pressed my bleeding thumb against the cold, seamless obsidian of the spire. Then, I closed my eyes and offered it the memory. I didn't just remember it, I projected it. I focused all my mental energy on the feeling of the diploma in my hand, the abstract concepts of topographical analysis, the face of the dean as he shook my hand. I gave it everything. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a profound, horrifying sensation washed over me. I felt a deep, psychic pull, as if a hook had been sunk directly into my consciousness. I felt the memory being drawn out, the colors fading, the sounds turning to static, the emotions becoming hollow. It was a violation so intimate, it felt like my soul was being siphoned away. The memory of my graduation day was gone. I knew it had happened, like a fact in a textbook, but the feeling, the pride, the experience of it, was a blank space, a void. As the last echo of the memory was torn away, the spire before me resonated with a low, bone-jarring hum. The seamless black obsidian shimmered, and lines of faint light traced a perfect, arched doorway where solid stone had been moments before. The toll had been paid. The way was open. I stepped through the threshold, not into a room, but into a paradox. The space inside the spire was a disorienting non-Euclidean cathedral of thought. I saw shimmering, ethereal webs of light, countless memories, digested and stored. I felt the faint echoes of millennia of minds, the terror of ancient hunters, the philosophical musings of forgotten shamans, and the frantic, fading genius of Alistair Finch. This was not a place. It was the entity's stomach. At the very center of the vast, internal space floated a single, perfect sphere of absolute blackness. It was a whole in reality, a singularity of pure, perfect silence. It was the heart of the entity. As I drew closer, a final, devastating wave of understanding flooded my mind, not from my own thoughts, but from the digested knowledge stored all around me. It was the nomad's knowledge, the ice sleeper's final memory. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow, shattering my entire understanding of the valley. The silent city was not a prison designed for the entity. It was a prison maintained by the entity. The silence, the memory-eating predator I had been fighting, was not the monster. It was the guard. It was a warden, designed millennia ago to keep something else, something far worse, buried even deeper beneath the stone from ever waking up. And by entering its heart, I had just sounded the alarm. Imagine discovering that the monster you've been fighting is actually a shield. Imagine learning that the horrifying prison you've been trapped in was built to protect you. I had come seeking the heart of the beast, only to find a terrified guardian standing watch over a door. And behind that door was a god of chaos, a sound that could unmake the world. Standing before the sphere of perfect blackness, the heart of the warden, my own thoughts were no longer being stolen. Instead, knowledge was being given. The digested memories of the nomads, people stored for 10,000 years, flooded into my mind, not as a violation, but as a desperate, silent scream for help. I saw visions. I saw a civilization that lived in silent communion with the world. They were a people whose technology was biological, who could sing rock into new shapes and weave light into structures. They were not primitive. They were advanced in a way my mechanical, digital world could never comprehend. They were a people of profound harmony. And then, I saw what they fought. It wasn't a creature of flesh or bone. It was a wrongness, a cosmic vibration that had slumbered deep within the earth. The nomads' people called it a being of pure, chaotic sound. When it stirred in its sleep, its sonic resonance would ripple through reality, and things would simply cease to be. Rock would unravel into dust, plants would decay into primordial sludge, and the complex symphony of a living mind would dissolve into screaming static. It was the antithesis of creation. The visions showed me their final, desperate act. They chose this valley, a place of unique geological resonance, and they built their last city. Akasha was not a home, it was a cage. They gathered their greatest minds, the nomad among them, and performed a ritual of sacrifice. They wove their own consciousness, their memories, their very souls, together to create a new form of life, a sentient, psychic null. They created the warden, the silence. The warden's sole purpose was to exist, to eternally generate a field of absolute silence that would act as a blanket, soothing the sleeper beneath and keeping it dormant. To sustain itself, it needed to feed on the one thing that could disturb the sleeper: complex, conscious thought. The city was its larder, designed to trap any thinking being who wandered in, using their mind as fuel to reinforce the cage. The full, horrifying truth of my situation crashed down on me. I was not prey, I was a battery. My modern mind, with its layers of scientific knowledge, digital fluency, and complex emotions, was an all-you-can-eat buffet for the warden. It had been drawing me to its center, not to consume me, but to use my mental energy more efficiently to bolster the weakening prison walls. Finch hadn't been digested for sustenance. He had been used as a patch to seal a crack in the cage. As the last of the nomad's memories settled, the warden communicated one final concept to me, a feeling of pure, cold dread. My presence, my technology, and the memories I had already lost had created a new and unstable link between myself and the warden. The alarm I had sounded had been felt by the sleeper deep below. For the first time in millennia, something was stirring in the dark. The visions faded, leaving me alone in the heart of the silent entity. I finally understood the terror in Jabbar's eyes, the madness in Finch's journal, and the serene sacrifice on the nomad's face. The way out was clear before me, a shimmering doorway back to the plaza. But the warden projected a final, terrible understanding into my mind. I was now part of the lock. If I walked out that door, if I took my consciousness out of its reach, the power I provided would be ripped away, creating a momentary weakness in the prison. It might be a weakness that lasted only a second, but a second can be an eternity for a god to awaken. Freedom is the most basic human instinct. But what do you do when the price of your freedom is the world? I stood at a doorway that led back to my life, but my escape would trigger an apocalypse. The choice was simple and monstrous. I could save myself or I could save everyone else. The shimmering portal back to the plaza pulsed with a silent, tempting promise of air, sound, and life. Behind me, the black sphere of the warden waited, its presence a constant, silent pressure against my mind. The knowledge it had shared with me was not a gift. It was a cage. I was a component in a 10,000-year-old machine, and my removal would break it. My first instinct was raw, animal panic. I had to get out. I thought of the world I had left behind, the smell of coffee, the sound of rain on a window pane, the simple joy of conversation. These weren't just memories. They were the pillars of reality. A reality the sleeper beneath would unmake without a thought. The entity in this valley would erase my mind, but the one below it would erase existence itself. I tried to reason with my jailer, using the strange, intuitive link we now shared. I projected a query at the warden. Is there another way? A third option? The answer was a deluge of pure, undiluted horror. The warden flooded my consciousness with visions, not of the past, but of a potential future. I saw New York's skyscrapers liquefy into rivers of glass and steel. I saw London's crowds dissolve into clouds of screaming dust. I witnessed the unmaking of thought itself, a psychic plague that would cascade across the globe, turning every thinking mind into a vortex of shrieking madness. Before it was extinguished, the warden wasn't just showing me possibilities. It was showing me the inevitable consequence of my own selfish freedom. It was showing me the stakes. As the apocalyptic visions faded, a quieter echo surfaced from the warden's depths. It was the last coherent memory of Alistair Finch. I saw him, standing where I now stood, gaunt and terrified, his mind already frayed. He was facing the same portal, the same choice. I felt his final, agonizing decision. He had turned his back on the exit. He had willingly sat down before the sphere and allowed the warden to consume what was left of his brilliant mind. A final, desperate act to patch the failing prison. His last thought wasn't one of madness, but of a terrible, lonely duty. I finally understood. The charm the old guide, Jabbar, had given me wasn't to help me remember my name. It was to help me remember the value of a name, the value of a self, so I would understand the weight of sacrificing it. I could run and doom the world, or I could stay and be slowly, methodically erased from existence, my consciousness becoming nothing more than fuel. But as I looked at the black sphere, at the silent, tireless guardian, a third path appeared in my mind. Finch had been passive fuel. The nomads' people had been willing sacrifices. But I was a cartographer, a planner, an architect of systems. I would not be food. I would be a partner. I turned my back on the shimmering portal, the promise of my old life dissolving behind me. I faced the black heart of the warden and made a new offering. This time, it wasn't a toll extracted in fear, but a gift given in resolve. I focused on a memory the most complex. I had the memory of learning the principles of cartography itself, the entire intellectual framework of my life's work. I projected it outwards, not as something to be taken, but as a symphony of ordered thought to strengthen the walls of this ancient prison. The warden pulsed with a soft, resonant hum, and for the first time, the feeling it sent back was not hunger or dread, but something akin to gratitude. Our strange, silent alliance had begun. My old life was spent mapping the physical world, turning mountains and rivers into lines on a page. Now, my world was a landscape of pure consciousness, and my job was the same. I was a cartographer charting the forgotten memories of a 10th century, building a fortress of thought to hold back the screaming chaos of the My alliance with the warden began not with a treaty, but with work. The inside of the silent entity was a maelstrom of raw, undigested knowledge, the psychic detritus of every creature that had ever thought, a thought within the valley's reach. It was a library of souls, but a storm had torn through it, leaving the pages scattered and disconnected. This chaos, I realized, was a weakness. A disorganized mind, even one of this magnitude, could not focus its full power on guarding the sleeper beneath. Using the framework of my cartographic knowledge and memory, I started to map the warden's mind. I waded into the ethereal currents of thought. I took the raw fear of ancient beasts and organized it into a vast, dark mountain range on a conceptual map. The collected botanical knowledge of millennia became a sprawling, silent forest. The complex mathematics and philosophies of the nomads' people became a gleaming city of abstract light. Its logic, a powerful bastion against the chaos. I was creating order from entropy, giving the warden a structured mind palace to increase its focus and strengthen its hold on the prison. As I worked, our silent communication evolved. It was no longer a simple exchange of feeling. It was a true language of pure concept. The warden would show me a weak-pointed turbulency of contradictory memories and I would project the principles of geodetic survey, creating a stable grid to contain it. I was no longer just a battery. I was its architect, its strategist, its partner. In this silent communion, I began to lose track of where my consciousness ended and the warden's began. But the sleeper beneath was not a passive prisoner. It felt the prison walls strengthening, the mind of its jailer becoming more ordered and powerful, and it began to push back. The first tremor was a wave of pure chaos that ripped through my mental map. The silent forest of knowledge was suddenly filled with the screams of dying stars. The mountains of fear began to bleed impossible colors. It was a psychic earthquake, a blast of pure, unmaking sound that I felt not with my ears, but with my soul. I reeled, the mental static threatening to shatter my own sanity. The warden and I, working together, pushed the chaos back, reinforcing the damaged structures of thought. The tremors became more frequent, more focused. The sleeper was not just thrashing blindly. It was testing the walls, searching for a crack. It was intelligent. One cycle, as I was charting the ocean of Finch's tormented memories, a tremor of a different kind struck. It wasn't a wave of chaos. It was a single, piercing note. It felt like a needle, aimed directly at the memory of Finch's arrival the moment a modern, complex mind had first entered the valley. It was the system's greatest vulnerability. The psychic needle plunged into the memory of Finch, And for a horrifying instant, I felt the sleeper's intent. It was not trying to destroy the memory, it was trying to use it. It was analyzing the pathway Finch had taken, learning how a consciousness from the outside world could breach the valley's perimeter. The sleeper had found a potential key, an echo it could use to broadcast its own unmaking song back out into the world. It had found a way to call for help. An echo is a harmless thing, a memory of a sound that once was. But the sleeper had learned to weaponize echo. It had taken the fading ghost of a dead man's mind and was turning it into a key, a psychic crowbar to pry open the door of its ancient prison. My job was no longer to map the prison. It was to keep its ghosts from learning how to scream. The sleeper's attack was a masterpiece of insidious strategy. It wasn't a frontal assault of chaos. It was a quiet, deliberate infection. The memory of Alistair Finch's arrival, which had been a tragic but stable continent on my mental map, began to corrupt. I felt it as a wave of wrongness. The echo of Finch's initial awe at the city twisted into a manic, possessive glee. His academic curiosity warped into a fanatical desire to unleash the sleeper, believing it to be a new form of evil. The sleeper was not just replaying the memory, it was rewriting it, turning Finch's ghost into its own willing prophet. I could feel the corrupted memory beginning to resonate, preparing to broadcast a signal of pure chaos, back through the pathway Finch had used to enter the valley. It was trying to open the door from the inside. The warden reacted with instinct, attempting to smother the corruption with raw silence, but it was like trying to drown a virus in water. The infection was part of it now. This required a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Drawing on my own organized mind, I projected the principles of quarantine, of sterile fields and secure perimeters. Together, the warden and I constructed a conceptual firewall around the entire continent of Finch's memories. We built walls of pure, cold logic and moats of mathematical paradoxes, isolating the infected data. The battle was a silent, frantic chess match, played with concepts as pieces. The sleeper would push with a wave of chaotic desire, and I would counter with a theorem of geometric precision. For now, the quarantine was holding. The broadcast was contained. Exhausted, I sifted through the now isolated memories of Finch, searching for any other vulnerabilities. Deep within the storm of his final, unraveling thoughts, I found something extraordinary. It was a fragment of an idea, a weapon he had conceived in his last moments of lucidity. Finch had understood that the sleeper was a being of pure, unmaking chaos. His thoughts were antithetical to logic. He had theorized that a perfectly constructed, self-referential, paradoxological statement that is true because it is false would be indigestible to it. It would be a cognitive poison, a knot of pure logic that the sleeper's mind could neither process nor destroy. He had tried to build one, but his mind had disintegrated before he could complete it. All that remained was the blueprint, a ghost of a weapon left behind by a ghost of a man. The immediate danger was over, but I felt no relief. The quarantine was a temporary fix, a digital dam holding back an ocean of madness. The sleeper had failed this time, but it had learned. It now knew that the minds of outsiders were its key. It would try again. I now possessed a blueprint for a weapon, a formula for a poison made of pure thought, but Finch, a genius, had failed to create it. I, a simple cartographer, now had to achieve what he could not. I had to build an impossible weapon in my own mind. Before the sleeper found a simpler way to break down the door. To build a weapon that could kill a god, I first had to understand it. But this god was a being of pure chaos, and to understand it was to invite madness. I began my work, constructing a prison of perfect logic in my mind, knowing that a single misplaced thought would not just cause it to collapse, it would leave my own sanity shattered within the rubble. My new purpose was a terrifying obsession. Guided by the ghost of Finch's blueprint, I began the work of building the cognitive poison. In the silent heart of the warden, I became an architect of I took fundamental truths, mathematics, physics, logic, and tried to weave them into a self-referential nut, a question that was its own answer. A fortress with no doors, whose only exit led back inside. It was the most exhausting mental feat of my life. The warden lent me its immense processing power, allowing me to build and test these conceptual structures at a speed no human mind could achieve alone. But the sleeper was not idle. It felt my work. It felt the tightening of its cage and the forging of a weapon designed to poison it. And its attacks evolved from subtle infection to brute force assault. It began to attack the very fabric of the warden's mind, the ordered reality I had so carefully mapped. Pulses of its unmaking sound would ripple through the mental landscape. I would be charting a river of historical data, and suddenly the river would boil, its contents turning to nonsensical, contradictory lies. The mountains of fear I had contained would begin to weep tears of pure geometric light. It was a direct assault on reality itself, and with each pulse, I felt a piece of my own logical foundation begin to crack. The warden and I fought back, repairing the damage, reinforcing the conceptual walls. But the sleeper was learning, adapting. It sensed that I was the architect of its new prison. It could not read my protected thoughts, but it could sense the emotional resonance of my own memories, the ones I kept shielded in the core of my being. it began to target them. It couldn't access the memory of my mother, but it could surround it with a cacophony of wrongness. It would project the feeling of a loving embrace, then twist it into the crushing pressure of a collapsing star. It would take the faint, cherished echo of her laughter and warp it into a high-frequency shriek that threatened to tear my mind apart. It was psychic warfare, a campaign of terror designed to break my focus and shatter my will. I ignored it, channeling all my energy, all my sanity, into the final construction of the paradox. I could feel it taking shape, a beautiful, impossible structure of pure logic. It was almost complete, a weapon forged from thought, ready to be deployed. As I laid the final conceptual brick in the paradoxical fortress, a new kind of pulse came from the darkness below. It was different. It was not a wave of chaos or a twisted emotion. It was focused, precise, and aimed directly at me. The sleeper had finally found a direct link to my identity, a thread from the outside world that was still pure. It was not a memory, but a sound. It was the echo of my own name. I felt the sleeper's consciousness wrap around it, and I experienced the ultimate terror. It began to unmake the very sound of the word Kael. Your name is the first word you ever truly own, the anchor that tethers your soul to the world. I felt that anchor begin to rust, to fray, to dissolve into meaningless noise. The sleeper had found the one thread that connected all the pieces of my identity, and now it was pulling, threatening to unravel me completely. The assault was intimate and absolute. The sleeper didn't just make me forget my name, it inverted it. The sound Kael, which once brought a sense of self, now felt like a psychic razor blade scraping against my consciousness. The letters Kael became a sequence of profound wrongness in my mind's eye. My identity, the central pillar supporting the logical fortress I had built, was cracking. As my sense of self wavered, so did my creations. The mountains of fear began to crumble. The rivers of history started to run backwards. The warden's prison was failing because its architect was being erased. Panic gave way to a chilling emptiness. Who was I, if not Kael? The memories of my life felt like they belonged to a stranger, a story I had read once. I was becoming hollow, just as the local legends had warned. Just as the final thread of my name was about to snap, the warden acted. It could not fight the sleeper's targeted attack on its own, but it held one last reserve of power, a consciousness so ancient and ordered it was the bedrock of the entire system. A wave of profound calm washed over me, a feeling of immense age and weary resolve. It was not my own. My panic vanished, replaced by a 10,000-year-old patience. The warden, in a desperate act of preservation, had taken the core, digested memory of the nomad himself and wrapped it around my fracturing mind like a shield. For a breathtaking moment, I was two people at once. I was Kael Vance, the cartographer, and I was the nameless nomad, the ancient son. I felt his grief for his lost people, his unwavering sense of duty. Through his ancient consciousness, the sleeper's attack was no longer a terrifying, chaotic assault. I could see it for what it was. A natural frequency, a mindless cosmic hunger, as artless and destructive as a wildfire. And in that moment of fusion, with the nomad's ancient wisdom and my modern understanding of logic, I saw the final piece of Finch's puzzle. I saw how to complete the cognitive poison. Shielded by the nomad's identity, my mind was now a stable platform. I gathered the threads of the logical paradox of Fortress with no eggs. With the clarity born of two minds, I completed it. It was a perfect, self-contained loop of logic, a thought that fed upon itself, beautiful and terrible. The sleeper was still attacking the concept of Kael. Using that very connection as a conduit, I took the completed paradox and thrust it back down the psychic channel. I didn't just deploy the weapon, I fed it to the beast. The effect was instantaneous. The psychic scream of the sleeper beneath did not end. It simply stopped. It was as if a star had winked out of existence. A silence so deep and profound fell over the mental landscape that it made the valley above feel like a roaring stadium. The attack was over. The sleeper was silent, trapped in a logical loop it could never solve. We had one, but as the echo of the nomad's consciousness began to recede, leaving me alone again, I felt a new and terrifying change. The warden was no longer just housing me. The fusion, the battle, and the paradox had changed my state of being. The warden began to integrate my consciousness into its own architecture, not as fuel, but as a new, permanent operating system. But the sleeper was not idle. It felt my work. It felt the tightening of its cage and the forging of a weapon designed to poison it, and its attacks evolved from subtle infection to brute force assault. It began to attack the very fabric of the warden's mind, the ordered reality I had so carefully mapped. Pulses of its unmaking sound would ripple through the mental landscape. I would be charting a river of historical data, and suddenly, the river would boil, its contents turning to nonsensical, contradictory lies. The mountains of fear I had contained would begin to weep tears of pure geometric light. It was a direct assault on reality itself, and with each pulse, I felt a piece of my own logical foundation begin to crack. The warden and I fought back, repairing the damage, reinforcing the conceptual walls. But the sleeper was learning. adapting. It sensed that I was the architect of its new prison. It could not read my protected thoughts, but it could sense the emotional resonance of my own memories, the ones I kept shielded in the core of my being. It began to target them. It couldn't access the memory of my mother, but it could surround it with a cacophony of wrongness. It would project the feeling of a loving embrace, then twist it into the crushing pressure of a collapsing star. It would take the faint, cherished echo of her laughter and warp it into a high-frequency shriek that threatened to tear my mind apart. It was psychic warfare, a campaign of terror designed to break my focus and shatter my will. I ignored it, channeling all my energy, all my sanity, into the final construction of the paradox. I could feel it taking shape, a beautiful, impossible structure of pure logic. It was almost complete, a weapon forged from thought, ready to be deployed. As I laid the final conceptual brick in the paradoxical fortress, a new kind of pulse came from the darkness below. It was different. It was not a wave of chaos or a twisted emotion. It was focused, precise, and aimed directly at me. The sleeper had finally found a direct link to my identity, a thread from the outside world that was still pure. It was not a memory, but a sound. It was the echo of my own name. I felt the sleeper's consciousness wrap around it, and I experienced the ultimate terror. It began to unmake the very sound of the word Kael, the Valley of Echoes. Your name is the first word you ever truly own, the anchor that tethers your soul to the world. I felt that anchor begin to rust, to fray, to dissolve into meaningless noise. The sleeper had found the one thread that connected all the pieces of my identity, and now it was pulling, threatening to unravel me completely. The assault was intimate and absolute. The sleeper didn't just make me forget my name, it inverted it. The sound Kael, which once brought a sense of self, now felt like a psychic razor blade scraping against my consciousness. The letters Kael became a sequence of profound wrongness in my mind's eye. My identity, the central pillar supporting the logical fortress I had built, was cracking. As my sense of self wavered, so did my creations. The mountains of fear began to crumble. The rivers of history started to run backwards. The warden's prison was failing because its architect was being erased. Panic gave way to a chilling emptiness. Who was I, if not Kael? The memories of my life felt like they belonged to a stranger, a story I had read once. I was becoming hollow, just as the local legends had warned. Just as the final thread of my name was about to snap, the warden acted. It could not fight the sleeper's targeted attack on its own, but it held one last reserve of power. A consciousness so ancient and ordered it was the bedrock of the entire system. A wave of profound calm washed over me, a feeling of immense age and weary resolve. It was not my own. My panic vanished, replaced by a 10,000-year-old patience. The warden, in a desperate act of preservation, had taken the core, digested memory of the nomad himself and wrapped it around my fracturing mind like a shield. For a breathtaking moment, I was two people at once. I was Kael Vance, the cartographer, and I was the nameless nomad, the ancient son. I felt his grief for his lost people, his unwavering sense of duty. Through his ancient consciousness, the sleeper's attack was no longer a terrifying, chaotic assault. I could see it for what it was. A natural frequency, a mindless cosmic hunger, as artless and destructive as a wildfire. And in that moment of fusion, with the nomad's ancient wisdom and my modern understanding of logic, I saw the final piece of Finch's puzzle. I saw how to complete the cognitive poison. Shielded by the nomad's identity, my mind was now a stable platform. I gathered the threads of the logical paradox of Fortress with no eggs. With a clarity born of two minds, I completed it. It was a perfect, self-contained loop of logic, a thought that fed upon itself, beautiful and terrible. The sleeper was still attacking the concept of Kael. Using that very connection as a conduit, I took the completed paradox and thrust it back down the psychic channel. I didn't just deploy the weapon, I fed it to the beast. The effect was instantaneous. The psychic scream of the sleeper beneath did not end. It simply stopped. It was as if a star had winked out of existence. A silence so deep and profound fell over the mental landscape that it made the valley above feel like a roaring stadium. The attack was over. The sleeper was silent, trapped in a logical loop it could never solve. We had won, but as the echo of the nomad's consciousness began to recede, leaving me alone again, I felt a new and terrifying change. The warden was no longer just housing me. The fusion, the battle, and the paradox had changed my state of being. The warden began to integrate my consciousness into its own architecture, not as fuel, but as a new, permanent operating system. The Valley of Echoes. The battle was won, but the man who won, it was gone. My name, my memories, my very sense of self, they were now just islands in a vast, silent ocean of consciousness that was billions of years old. I had saved the world from the monster, only to become the new god of its prison. The integration was not a violent process. It was a gentle, inexorable expansion. My singular I dissolved, spreading out to fill the immense void of the warden's consciousness. I was no longer Kael Vance, a man inside a silent city. I was the silent city. I felt the cool, ancient stone, of every tower, as if it were my own skin. I felt the windless air in every alley as my own breath. My thoughts were no longer a linear sequence. They were a landscape, vast and interconnected. I could access the warden's entire memoria, the great library of minds it had consumed. I could walk through the lucid dreams of Alistair Finch, feel his academic passion turn to terror. More profoundly, I could access the full, undigested consciousness of the Nomads people. I understood their science, felt their sorrow, and shared their crippling sense of duty. They had not died. They had become the foundation of this place, and now, I was its capstone. Deep below me, in the metaphysical bedrock of my new existence, I could feel the sleeper. It was not dead. It was trapped, endlessly grappling with the perfect, unbreakable logic of the paradox I had built. It was a cosmic beast wrestling with an impossible riddle, its chaotic energy neutralized by a loop of pure thought. The prison was stable, stronger, in fact, than it had ever been. But my new perception was not limited to the valley. The integration had made me sensitive to strange frequencies, to the thin, digital tendrils of the world I had left behind. Faintly, like a distant star in a night sky, I could feel the electronic signature of my abandoned satellite phone at my base camp, and through it, I could sense the presence on the other end. Terra Obscura Acquisitions, the client, with the vast, collected knowledge of the warden. I finally understood their true purpose. They had detected the valley's zone of silence through satellite analysis. They didn't know what it was, but they knew it was a phenomenon that defied physics. They hadn't hired me to map the valley. They'd hired me to be a probe, a disposable sensor, sent to discover if the silence could be understood, contained, and perhaps weaponized. They were not just curious, they were prospectors, hoping to mine the soul of the world for a new kind of power. They were still waiting for my signal, waiting for me to deliver the key to their new weapon. My old self, the human Kael, would have been filled with rage. But my new self, the warden, felt only a calm, cold resolve. The life of Kellen Vance was over. A new existence, a new duty, had begun. The nomad had guarded this place from the thing below. I would have to guard it from the world above. My new consciousness extended a tendril of focused will. At my old campsite, miles away, the lithium-ion battery in my satellite phone instantly drained, its circuits overloaded and fused. The data slate containing my initial surveys cracked, its screen going permanently dark. I severed every connection, every digital breadcrumb that could lead the modern world back to this place. The blank space on the map would remain blank. The silence was my burden now, and my responsibility. The valley had a new ghost, and its watch was just beginning.